Hi, folks. Larry Taylor here. Glad you could join us again as we continue our look together at the Sermon on the Mount, which, of course, is recorded in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, and which is the central ethical teaching of all time. Christians and non-Christian scholars alike agree that the Sermon on the Mount is the most profound ethical teaching that has ever been recorded. It is also, as you might suspect, the center, the core of Jesus' teaching. And that's important to me because I believe that Jesus is the perfect reflection of God. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. If you want to understand the scriptures, listen to what Jesus said. And this is the heart of what Jesus said. Again, as I've mentioned a couple times previously, if you are just jumping into the middle, I encourage you to go back to the beginning of these sessions because they're building one on the next. And, obviously I don't have the time to repeat everything that we said privately or we'd never get anywhere. I mean, previously, not privately. It's public. So where we are now in Matthew chapter 5 is in verse 11. We have looked at the first 10 verses, which contain what we call the Beatitudes, 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are those who. Now, some people put verse 11 with the Beatitudes. They call the last one a double Beatitude or a ninth Beatitude because it also starts with the word blessed or the phrase, blessed are you. But I think it really belongs with verses 12 and 13. And the reason I think that, actually a couple reasons. One is that in verses 11, 12, and 13, Jesus uses the plural for the word you. So he's talking about the community of faith. He's talking about us collectively. He's talking about the group as a whole. Of course, in the setting, he's talking to a large group of people who were following him. Some very dedicated followers, others were people who were curious, just wanted to find out what was going on, just kind of checking it out. And you may fit in one of those categories, and whichever category you fit in, dedicated follower or just checking it out, you're most welcome. I do wish we had the opportunity to dialogue back and forth, but perhaps we'll find a way to do that down the road. At any rate, he uses the word plural, the word you, in the plural in verses 11, 12, and 13. So that's one reason why I think verse 11 goes with 12 and 13. Also, I think you'll see as we read it that they logically fit neatly together. Jesus says in verse 11, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you. Now, he has just talked about persecution in the last of the Beatitudes. In verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And now he says, blessed are you when others, you plural, when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you. Some manuscripts say against you falsely. Some leave out the word falsely. I think it's implied either way. When you're persecuted, not because you're really not being persecuted if you're just getting your just desserts for what you did. That's not persecution, at least in a general sense. We're talking about being persecuted falsely. People speaking evil of you falsely. I think that happens probably less than most of us think it does, at least here in Occidental civilization, Western civilization, the United States and Northern Europe. But it does happen, and it certainly is happening with our brothers and sisters around the world. So Jesus says, "Blessed are you," again, plural, "when others revile you, persecute you, utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people put a light or a lamp, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. But instead, they set it out on a stand where it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." A couple of things there. Notice how those three verses go together. Blessed are you if you're persecuted because people are coming against you, not for something bad you've done, but for something good you've done. And then he goes right into, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. I think in context, if you put it all together, what Jesus is saying is, we are called to be light to the world and salt to the earth. When we are really doing that, when we're really bringing light, when we really are acting like salt, some people will reject that, and persecution in the form of saying nasty things about us flows from that. So I don't make a big deal out of it, but I see verse 11 as being connected more with 12 and 13 than with verses 1 through 10. Of course, the thought flows. So really it's all connected, but maybe it's minutia that I'm considering. But here in verses 11, 12, and 13, Jesus is talking about our collective life, our life in community. This Christian life is always a life which is lived in community. It's never something that you can do alone. And that's contrary to what a lot of people, especially in America, believe, because Americans are very individualistic and all about self-made man and the rugged individual, go west young man, all that stuff. You know, the cowboy out there on his own. And we have misinterpreted the Christian walk as being something that we can do pretty much by ourselves. We personally, individually accept Jesus, and then we personally, individually read and interpret the Bible, and we personally and individually live our lives in such a way that we think is reflecting what Jesus wants us to do. That concept is not biblical. In fact, all through the Bible, Old and New Testament, you see God dealing with a group of people. He's called us to live in community. Now, most of us, some 85% of human beings are extroverted. Some of us, I'm one of these, are in the 15% that are very introverted. And so we draw energy. Some of us draw energy from being around others. Others of us, like me, I draw energy from quiet times and contemplative times. But even for folks like me, we are all of us called to be a part of a community of faith, to care for one another, to follow Jesus together, to connect with one another, encourage, pray for, help, minister to, serve one another. We travel this pilgrim road collectively, not individually. It's not all about me making it to heaven. It's all about us walking the path of God together and living together now as well as forever. So this collectiveness of the scripture comes out in these verses. And Jesus says, you collectively are to be the salt of the earth. He doesn't say you are to be. He says you are the salt of the earth. If you're a follower of Jesus, and I'm a follower of Jesus, then when you put us together, we are the salt of the earth. So it's not possible to salt your food with 1 grain of salt. Salt, the way it comes, is in a group. And so it is with me. I cannot be the salt of the earth by myself. Together, we're the salt of the earth. We who seek to follow Jesus. Together, we are the salt of the earth. Salt, in biblical times especially, had a broader use than it does in most of our lives today. In biblical times, they did use it the same way we normally do, which is to flavor food. And the reason we use salt that way is because salt not only has its own distinctive taste, but it brings out the flavors in the food that is salted. Obviously, you can oversalt things, but right amount enhances the flavor that's inherent within the food. And in biblical times, they knew that, and they used salt in that way. So if we collectively are the salt of the earth, part of what that means, I think, is that we bring out the best in other people. Together, encouraging one another, looking for one another's gifts, exhorting one another to use those gifts, always being there to point one another in the direction of love. Collectively, we can go out into the community and we can provide housing for some homeless people, or we can provide food for some hungry people, or we can provide care for some shut-ins. Collectively, we're able to do things that individually we either can't accomplish or we only can minimally accomplish. So collectively, we bring out the best in humanity. We recognize that people, all people, are created in the image and likeness of God. We see them as the imago Dei is the Latin word. The image of God is stamped in every human being. God created his beautiful temple. This is what the opening chapters of Genesis are all about. God created his beautiful temple. It's what we would call nature. And then he placed his image in that temple. Human beings, a man and a woman, and God looked at it and said, it's very good. And all those things that were created, including us, were created through Jesus the Messiah. Scripture also makes that very plain. And so collectively, we're adding flavor, as it were, to the world around us, looking for the good things and drawing those good things out and encouraging those good things, joining with people, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or people of no faith, who are doing good things. We're joining with them in advancing those causes of justice and grace. And by so doing, we're being the salt of the earth. Salt was also used, especially in biblical times, really throughout history until the invention of the ice box, and later, of course, the invention of electricity, which gave us electrically run freezers and refrigerators. Prior to that time, salt was used as a preservative. The meat was salted and therefore preserved from spoiling. Collectively, we are a preservative force in the culture in which we live, preserving the good things. I'm not talking about necessarily just old-fashioned traditions, but preserving the goodness that we have inherited. Relationships between spouses, parents and children, caring for one's neighbor. These kinds of things are things that are perpetuated partially because Christians are willing to be the salt of the earth, preventing the spread of corruption by doing that which is good, by drawing out the goodness in others and preserving the goodness that we find around us. Again, God has called us to join him as he makes all things new. And being the salt of the earth is part of that process, joining God as he makes all things new. And then Jesus says collectively, you're the light of the world. I think in the context here, earth and world, actually the word translated world is cosmos, but the part of the cosmos that we can reasonably affect is also the world. So I mean the earth. So earth, world, I think they're used here interchangeably. Jesus says that collectively we're the salt of the earth. And he says that collectively we're the light of the world. And again, notice that it's plural. He's not talking about each of us being a little flicker of light, and then we bring the little flickers of light together and maybe we have some more light. No, he's saying when you are doing life together in faith, when you are being the church, when you're being the community of God, when you are collectively with your sisters and brothers following the Sermon on the Mount, living in an attitude of love and obedience towards God, loving God with all our hearts collectively, loving each other collectively, loving nature collectively, even responding to our enemies with love collectively as well as individually. When we're doing that, we're the light of the world, and that light cannot be hidden. One of the sad commentaries in the world is that when you have a group of people who are living like that, there almost invariably are people who get upset. They not only object, but they I hesitate to use the word persecute because we often think of persecution as being just something that's physical. But the point is that people come against us sometimes when we're doing that which is light and good. And you wonder, why is that? Martin Luther King Jr. spearheaded became the spokesperson for an entire movement. And he did not do this alone. This was a community, and it was a community of faith that came out of the African American churches. All the leaders of the civil rights movement were ordained ministers. Most of them were. And as a community of faith, they came together seeking to live by the Sermon on the Mount, to love their enemies, to stand up against injustice, but to do it in such a way as they were loving their enemies with the prayer in their hearts that what they were doing would not only liberate them from oppression, but would also liberate the oppressors. And yet, Martin Luther King Jr. and the others were vilified, hated, dogs were sicked on them, fire hoses were turned on them, some of them were murdered, some of them were lynched, some of them were fired from their jobs, mocked, rocks thrown at them, spit on, hated. Even at the time Martin Luther King Jr. died, he was hated by the majority of Americans. Now, today, the majority of Americans think, oh, what a great hero he was, and he was. But that was not popular opinion back in those days. But you look at that and you think, why were people so upset? Why did they get so angry? He wasn't doing anything to hurt them. In fact, what they were doing, was advancing the cause of justice, which is good for everybody. But Satan always fights against the light and the peace and the justice. Satan's kingdom is exactly opposite of God's kingdom. The kingdom of this world, Satan's kingdom, is a kingdom of violence and hatred and prejudice. And so persecution comes. But Jesus said, when it comes, rejoice, because that's the way they treated the prophets in the Old Testament. It's an earmark that you're with the people of God, doing the things of God, joining God as God makes all things new. Collectively, you're being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And the world is not able to extinguish that light. So rejoice, because God is using you. See you next time.